Nintendo had a pretty rough time with the N64. While their old sparring partner Sega arguably had it far worse with the Saturn, the newcomer Sony and the PlayStation thoroughly embarrassing the pair of them. Even more so when you consider how the PlayStation started out its life, a failed partnership between the gaming powerhouse and the electronics giant to produce a disc-based add-on for the SNES. The follow-up to the N64 started its life in 1997. Several former engineers of SGI, the company that produced what would eventually become the N64 graphics processor, broke away to start their own company. This company was called ArtX. Their goal was to create the graphics processors for IBM PC clones. ArtX was headed up by Dr. Wei Yen, who happened to be the former head of Nintendo operations when working for SGI. The previous relationship with Nintendo, along with IBM being contracted to produce the CPU for the new console, led to them being contracted to work on the graphics processor for the Nintendo 64 successor in 1998. A partnership with Panasonic was struck to manufacture the disk drive that would be used in the console, this being the first Nintendo hardware to use the disk format for software, moving away from the cartridges that had been used for the past few decades. Codenamed Dolphin, what was to become the GameCube was announced publicly in May of 1999. Not long after this, ArtX was acquired by ATI Technologies. Thankfully, the acquisition didn't have any impact on their work with Nintendo, the majority of the work being completed before it went through. ATI actually seemed relatively pleased with what was effectively their new partnership with Nintendo, with a spokesperson saying that they had now become a major player in the console market thanks to it. I guess it ended up being true. ATI went on to develop the graphics processor for the Xbox 360 a few years later, before being acquired by AMD, who have been integral in the development of the last few consoles from both Sony and Microsoft. Nintendo formally announced the GameCube, dropping the Dolphin moniker on August 25, 2000, during a press conference in Japan, with more details such as the launch lineup being revealed at E3 the following year. Nintendo's penchant for hardware oddities continued with the GameCube. The machine's form factor was relatively unusual, especially compared to the competition. It was tiny, around half the size of the PS2, though a little taller and positively minuscule compared to the behemoth that was the original Xbox. As its name suggested, it was more or less a cube in shape, and even had a small carrying handle on the back of the console, making it truly portable. Though it was still a home console, and the Switch was 15 years away at this point, you'd still need something to put the power supply, AV cable and controller in, as well as some kind of TV to play it on the go, so the carrying handle is somewhat redundant. It was cute though. As previously mentioned, Nintendo had finally opted to move from cartridges to disc-based media this generation. This is where another one of their hardware quirks enters the frame. They didn't go with the standard DVD format that was used by the PS2 and Xbox, instead opting for a proprietary solution. GameCube discs are a third of the size of regular DVDs, 80mm in diameter rather than 120. Their smaller size, while it contributed to being able to make the console smaller, meant they had less capacity to work with compared to their full-size brethren. GameCube discs are only 1.46 gig in capacity, compared to a regular DVD's 4.7 gig of storage. This generally wasn't that much of a problem. Most games fit onto the discs, but some bigger or more graphically demanding titles like Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes and Resident Evil 4 required multiple discs. The smaller discs also had the added benefit of making piracy more difficult to achieve on the GameCube, in theory anyway. One of the disadvantages of the smaller discs and form factor was that the GameCube was unable to play regular DVD movies. Given the price of a DVD player in the early 2000s, this was a pretty serious black mark against the system. The PS2 had been out a year or so when the GameCube released and could play DVDs right out of the box, allowing it to pull double duty as a media centre. Likewise, when it launched, the Xbox could do the same, albeit with the caveat of needing a sold separately remote. This was remedied somewhat with a later revision of the console. The Panasonic Q GameCube was a slightly larger version of the machine, with enough space to fit a standard DVD inside and the ability to play them added. It was a complete redesign of the console. The door at the top of the console for discs was gone, replaced with a front-loading tray, and a backlit LCD screen was situated at the top of the console, with playback controls for movies. It's an incredibly cool-looking revision of the GameCube, with a mirrored front panel and a stainless steel chassis. Unfortunately though, it was only ever released in Japan and was actually discontinued well before the main GameCube, in December of 2003. Its limited release window and region contributed to it becoming relatively difficult to come by now, and they tend to fetch a high price when they turn up. As with most systems at the time, GameCube had no internal storage, and as such memory cards were required for game saves, with 3 different first-party offerings available. Nintendo abandoned the trident design of the N64 for its controller on the GameCube. It follows a more or less standard dual analog layout with offset sticks. It's quite an odd design visually, but it's actually very comfortable and a lot of thought has gone into the ergonomics of it. The triggers are contoured, for example. The place fingers fit nicely onto them without slipping off when in use. It's not a big thing, but it's a nice touch. In terms of feel, the GameCube controller is by far my favourite controller. There's a few less buttons than the Xbox and PS2 controllers, a left bumper is missing, and there's no select button. It's not normally a problem, but there's the odd multi-platform game that has to make changes to compensate. A wireless revision called the Wavebird was released in 2002, making it the first wireless controller developed and released by a first-party console manufacturer. It uses an RF receiver rather than infrared used by TV remotes and the like. This meant the line of sight wasn't necessary for the unit to work. The Wavebird nearly ceased to be in the US thanks to a lawsuit from a Texas company called Addons. They claimed that Nintendo had infringed on several of their patents. A ban was issued in 2008 that would prevent Nintendo from selling the controller in the US. Nintendo appealed, however, and was free to continue selling them until a decision was made. In 2010, the US Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled in favour of Nintendo, and sales of the controller were allowed to continue. The previous couple of Nintendo consoles all had ways of playing their handheld games on a TV through them. The SNES had the Super Game Boy, and the N64 had the Transfer Pack and third-party Game Boy player. The Game Boy Advance player released for the GameCube in the summer of 2003, it was the same shape as the GameCube itself, and connected seamlessly to the bottom of the console. A slightly larger version was even released in Japan to fit the Panasonic Q model. It allowed, as you might expect, the Game Boy Advance library to be played on the TV through the GameCube. Rather than emulating the Game Boy Advance though, it has what is essentially a complete Game Boy Advance inside it for a flawless experience. The hardware itself is region free, however the boot disc required to run it is not. The plays themselves can be picked up relatively cheaply now, but the discs that came with the player have risen in value significantly over the last few years and show no signs of slowing down. During this generation, online connectivity was starting to become more common, with the Dreamcast and Xbox being online enabled out of the box, and the PS2 having the functionality added post-launch. Nintendo kept online support for the GameCube at arm's length, however. Both dial-up and broadband modems were released in October of 2002, and mere 8 games shipped with support, and only 4 of those had online play, with the other 4 having LAN support. The GameCube was released on September 14th, 2001 in Japan, and a month later in the US. The EU had to wait a further 6 months to get their hands on the console. It launched at $200 in the US and £129 in the UK, which was incredibly cheap for a newly released console at the time. Nintendo continued their tradition of tiny launch lineups in Japan, with only 3 titles available to begin with. Despite this, it wasn't awful, but it didn't have the saving grace of a Mario 64 equivalent this time around, this being the first time since the Famicom that a Nintendo console released without a Mario title available. It expanded significantly for the North American launch a month later, with 12 titles making it to market on day one. Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race Blue Storm, and Super Monkey Ball returned from the Japanese launch, and were joined by a host of sports games, Crazy Taxi, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, as well as the fantastic Rogue Squadron 2 by Factor 5. It was a decent lineup that had something for pretty much everyone, with a good selection of third-party titles. The GameCube generally had a much better relationship with third-party developers and publishers, something that the N64 had been sorely lacking. Sales initially started out fairly strongly. In Japan, 300,000 units were sold in the first 3 days of release, and in North America, several stores sold out entirely. However, it garnered a mixed response at the time. It was praised for having a decent lineup of games at launch, and critics spoke highly of the price and controller design. Criticism was aimed at the lack of features compared to other consoles on the market, such as the lack of DVD playback. This was the overall feel of the console, with some outlets branding it as childish and toy-like. The GameCube wasn't the massive return to dominance that Nintendo were hoping for, selling a relatively low 21 million units across its lifespan, significantly less than the N64 before it, only just managing to outsell the Xbox in Japan. It was crushed by the PS2 in sales, but I don't think it's fair to hold that against it, because in the 6th console generation, everything was crushed by the PS2. Discontinued in 2007, 6 years after it released and a year after its successor, the Wii had arrived. Despite this, accessories continued to be manufactured by Nintendo, thankfully due to the backwards compatibility of the Wii, fully supporting the GameCube library. This is probably the best way to play GameCube games legitimately at the moment. Nintendo hasn't added any kind of update to Nintendo Switch Online adding games, and there's no GameCube Classic around. The Wii is super affordable thanks to the sheer number of consoles manufactured, and easily plugs into modern TVs thanks to component support or a cheap HDMI adapter. Unfortunately, the games are another matter entirely. The GameCube library has been steadily increasing in price over the last few years and is only continuing to rise. It does have an excellent emulator available in Dolphin, but that isn't a solution for everyone. I love the GameCube. I don't think it's possible to overstate that. It definitely didn't sell as well as the PS2, or have a game library that came anywhere near and close in terms of volume, but it has a charm all of its own that isn't shared by any other console from that generation for me. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider leaving us a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. What are your thoughts on the GameCube? Do you have a favourite game, or did you stick with the PS2 and Xbox for this generation? Let me know down in the comments.